the time of the apostles was foundational. As we know, the apostles came into direct contact with Jesus Christ. Later on, after the time of the apostles, there were the church fathers who formulated certain affirmations of the faith, and they were taking from the insights of the apostolic times. The church fathers themselves were not very far from the time of Jesus Christ. They were not very far from the time of the apostles. And so they were quite close to the source, Jesus Christ. Now, at a particular moment in time, the church fathers needed to be clear about certain texts, certain documents that will reflect the faith, that will really talk about the faith. Certain texts were important because they were going to be the official texts for the Christian communities. And so it was necessary for the church fathers to canonize certain texts. When we say canonize, we mean that certain texts were accepted as official for the faith. They were texts that were seen to be reflecting the faith. Other texts, other manuscripts, other documents were not accepted. They did not form part of the canonized texts. So when we say canonized, that means certain texts were accepted as officially reflecting our faith. And as we know, those canonized texts were the 4 Gospels. The Gospel account of Mark, the Gospel account of Matthew, the Gospel account of Luke, and the Gospel account of John. The church fathers looked at these texts and felt that the texts were really faithful and very close to the faith, to the insights of the apostles. Other texts, other written texts outside the accepted texts did not show being very close to the faith of the apostles. Now, the church fathers really relied on the scriptures, especially the New Testament texts. But they also looked at the Old Testament. The church fathers were motivated by a question. What was this question? It was the question of what is the link between the Jewish texts of the Old Testament and the Christian texts of the New Testament. Did the Jewish texts, the Old Testament, point to Jesus Christ? Was the Old Testament saying something about Jesus? Was the Old Testament prophesying about Jesus? So the church fathers had to go back and look into the Old Testament. They had to retrospect. Back into the Old Testament, retrospect. Back into the Old Testament to see how the Old Testament was leading to Jesus Christ. The New Testament about Jesus Christ was already contained in the Old Testament, but in a hidden way. The Old Testament was fulfilled in the New Testament. We see this importance of the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament as understood by the Church Fathers. The Church Fathers tried to discern if the Old Testament was pointing to Jesus Christ. And so, looking back into the Old Testament, the Church Fathers felt that something of the New Testament was already hidden in the Old Testament. For the Church Fathers, the Old Testament was already pointing to Jesus Christ. Now we have to make it clear that this was how the Church Fathers looked at the Old Testament. This was how the Church Fathers looked at the Old Testament. This was a Christian reading of the Old Testament. In fact, if we look at the New Testament itself, and if we look at parts of the New Testament, we see that this way of thinking was already working in the minds of the authors of the New Testament texts. The disciples themselves were already questioning if Jesus himself was the prophet as promised by the Jewish tradition, by the Old Testament. So the disciples were asking if Jesus was the prophet promised, for example, by Moses. So in the New Testament, we already see disciples of Jesus, gospel writers. They were all looking back into the Old Testament and asking if there was something in the Old Testament that was pointing to Jesus Christ. Notice then that this was how the New Testament authors and the disciples of Jesus were thinking. This was how they were relating with the Old Testament. If we look at the story of the road to Emmaus in the Gospel according to Luke, we will notice how strong this looking back, this retrospect was. We remember there in that story in the road to Emmaus, we see the looking back. The Old Testament scriptures pointed to Jesus Christ. Notice that there was a style of treating the scriptures, especially the Old Testament. The Church Fathers, the authors of the New Testament, and the disciples of Jesus, all of them were looking back into the Old Testament to see how the Old Testament was pointing to Jesus Christ. This was the Christian way of reading the Old Testament. Today, we still find this practice in the church. We still look back into the Old Testament and relate the Old Testament with Jesus Christ. So there is a unity in reading the whole Bible. We begin with Jesus Christ, and then we look back, we retrospect into the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is understood in the light of Jesus and the New Testament. Again, this was a practice in the old times of the church, and it continues to be the practice today.